welcome back to another episode of Cinema History. This time we are going to be talking about the Nickelodeon, not the kids channel on TV with all the really weird shows involving feet and slime. 1901. There was a vaudeville performers strike. This gets awkward, okay? The White Rats Labor Union, this is a very fitting name. That's not why they chose the name, but it still fits. It was led by a man named George Fuller Golden and was inspired by the British fraternity, the Grand Order of Water Rats. I don't know why they liked rats so much, but okay. They were attempting to combat the monopolistic practices of the United Booking Offices and the Vaudeville Managers Association, groups formed by vaudeville theater managers in order to keep performers' wages low and control when and where the performers were allowed to work. The White Rats are trying to combat the United blah blah blah, vaudeville managers, all those. They were formed in 1900. This is why the name is really fitting. They excluded women, but also African American performers, so and pretty much any minority group. It didn't matter that they were also vaudeville performers. If they were excluded. It was just a bunch of white men in this labor union. Seems like you'd want some more allies, but this was the year 1900, so I guess whatever. The leadership committee of the White Rats got right to work trying to negotiate with the VMA to reduce or remove a 5% kickback that each act was required to pay in exchange for being booked on the VMA circuit. It was desirable to be booked on the circuit. You'd probably make more money from the acts, but then the theater pretty much got it all. The negotiations failed, of course, and the White Rats called a strike in February of 1901. The Western States branch of the VMA gave in to the union demands, but the Eastern branch just went without vaudeville for 2 weeks. So they're like, you're not going to perform? Fine, whatever. Up to this point, films shown in vaudeville theaters were the closing act. The chaser, to clear out the audience at the end of the show. So the vaudeville performers would do all their live performances, and then they would close it out with this like one real short film, that would be a couple minutes long. And everyone would file out. So that was the chaser at the end of the show. When the White Rats led the vaudeville performers' strike, theaters scrambled to find more films to play. So since they were going without live performances, they needed more films. They had to buy the films at this time straight from the factories by mail order, which was very costly, especially because they wanted to be able to change what they were showing frequently enough to keep up with the audience demand. So that made it extremely expensive and time-consuming. It was difficult to get that many films at that rate. So, not a good situation for the theaters. In 1902, a Henry Miles of San Francisco began renting films to theaters, which was the beginning of today's film distribution system. Los Angeles, the Electric Theater, housed in a tent, opened in 1902 and first screened the short film New York in a Blizzard. Admission cost a dime for a 1-hour show. Pittsburgh theatrical manager Harry Davis and his partner John Harris developed the Nickelodeon Theater in response to showing more films in the vaudeville theaters. On June 19, 1905, 450 people attended the grand opening of the converted storefront theater on Smithfield Street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. While previous theaters had shown films, as I've said, they also still featured live vaudeville acts. Davis and Harris's Nickelodeon, on the other hand, was the first theater dedicated solely to the exhibition of films. It operated by showing films in a continual loop, and admission cost, you guessed it, a nickel. The term Nickelodeon was coined because nickel, obviously 5 cents, and Odeon was a Greek word for theater, so really very, very simple word, a nickel theater. The venture was incredibly successful and so widely duplicated that by 1908, 8,000 Nickelodeons had cropped up across the country, and by 1910 it was estimated that up to 26 million Americans visited the theaters weekly. They were widely and often criticized for being poorly ventilated and dirty, with uncomfortable seating, usually just wooden hardback chairs or benches. Most were converted storefronts like the original and could only seat up to about 200 people at most. Some 75, I think, was the low end, and then up to 200. But several were built to seat 1,000, leading to the, what do they call it? Movie palaces of the 1920s. A screen would usually just be hung over a back wall, and a piano would sit below or next to the screen for a live musician to play along with the films. So they'd have a store of random musical pieces that they would play, you know, like The Entertainer. All those songs that were written by pretty much all the same, like 3 people and sound very similar. That very plinky piano, you know, do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Okay, I'm gonna not do that. All right. So, the modern soundtrack obviously had not been invented yet, developed. They weren't doing synced music. Now, the live musician would do that. Sometimes also, the theater managers would narrate the films before they started doing the black screens. I can't remember. The like title card things, but they were in between intra titles, I think is what they're called. There'd be a few little bits of action, someone would say something and they'd pop that black screen, you know what I'm talking about, with what they're supposedly saying. And so that sort of phased out the narration, the live narration by the theater managers or whoever worked there at the time. So another little tidbit. This is just little steps, increments moving us toward the modern movie theater. Louis B. Mayer, future studio head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and the guy who almost single-handedly destroyed Judy Garland's life. Maybe we'll get into that some other time. He came of age as the Nickelodeon rose in popularity, and he soon after renovated the Gem Theater in Haverhill, Massachusetts, opening it in 1907 under the new name the Orpheum Theater. He devoted this theater to the exhibition of Miles Brothers moving pictures and illustrated songs. Illustrated songs were projected sequential paintings made to illustrate whatever popular musical piece was being performed. So they'd have the music going, a little music, they'd play the music, and they would have, someone would have illustrated in different paintings, and so they would project these paintings. There you go, illustrated songs. That's a very definite term. It doesn't sound extremely definite, but that was literally that right there. Sequential paintings about the song. I'm going on way too much about this. I just thought it was interesting that that term was so finite, but maybe that's just me. So Nickelodeon's helped to cement the business of film exchanges, which is what Henry Miles in San Francisco had done, where he would have a storage of these films and rent them out to the theaters. And these distributor companies, the film exchanges, that's what they were called, would buy the films from the manufacturers and then rent them out to the exhibitors, allowing the theaters to have a steady flow of new material. Very important, because you know people have super short attention spans and they don't want to see the same film over and over and over again unless they're a small child. I can't tell you how many movies my kids have ruined for me. Watching it repeatedly. What, Rocky? What? The distributor companies renting these out, all this new material. So unlike today with set showing schedules, and they would literally splice them together and kind of so that it would be on a continual loop, and people would come in at whatever point. They'd just come in, pay their nickel, and they would stay as long as they wanted. That way they might see the last half of one movie and the first half of another movie. A lot of these films at the time were kind of short films, 15 minutes or so. So it was a very casual pastime, and most of the patrons didn't really care how dirty it was. They're not there very long. They just want to see a quick little film. It was just easy entertainment. The Nickelodeon is also why we have the term spectator. I don't think it was invented for it, but just this sort of mindset of moviegoers as simply spectators. I don't know, it was almost said, I don't remember who it was that coined it, not coined it, but that said it was kind of derogatory. Like, oh, the simple masses, the filthy masses taking in their movies, spectators, ugh. But anyway, that was another little interesting note, and that kind of came about with Nickelodeons. It's what popularized films to the masses, because the Nickelodeons were prolific. They were everywhere. So even though these Nickelodeons had begun solely to show film, some started to kind of go backward and still incorporate vaudeville acts and illustrated songs, like Louis B. Mayer's Orpheum Theater. So that was another thing. But the booming popularity of Nickelodeons created a massive demand for a constant flow of new material from studios. Most of the films shown were 10 to 15 minutes long, which I said. But longer films soon became desirable so that the exhibitors wouldn't have to spend so much time editing together so many short films for an entire day's program. And as most charged more the longer the film, because of that, the longer films provided a larger profit margin because they weren't spending more on renting them, but they were charging more if the films were longer. And then fictional films were becoming more popular as well, which worked out well as the studios were wanting to make more elaborate stories to differentiate themselves from other creators and other productions. And the directors, these movie directors, they were storytellers. They were longing for the opportunity for more artistic innovation. So the demand for longer films, along with the technology and people who were artistic, coming into the art form, kind of all converged right at the same time to produce longer films. Unfortunately, as feature films became more popular, cities grew, industries were consolidated, and moviegoer attendance expanded so rapidly, the Nickelodeon's popularity waned. People wanted more comfortable accommodations, and they needed larger theaters to accommodate everybody. That's a lot of accommodations in one paragraph. As the larger theaters were being built, the Nickelodeons became less and less popular, and by 1916, the Nickelodeons were practically obsolete. Now, if you remember, the first one came about in 1905, so this is 11 years, but they were so crucial to the growth of the film industry by making film easily accessible and affordable for the masses. It was said by some, it's argued, who made up the audience on the whole. A lot of people think it was just like the kind of crummy, I don't mean this derogatory, it was derogatory in the descriptions, like the dirty lower classes, the working class, blue collar people, just kind of low class, being in all of these dirty Nickelodeons. But there were also Nickelodeons in nicer neighborhoods. So a lot of the middle class were going too. It was just nice, easy entertainment. Regardless, whoever comprised most of the moviegoer echelon, Nickelodeons were absolutely crucial to the growth of the film industry. The first I had ever heard of a Nickelodeon was in a book about film history, but the description was that of a kinetoscope or a mutoscope, which was a hand crank device into which you would insert a nickel and be able to view a short film. I should probably insert a picture of one. You'd stand over it and kind of look into the thing, and it would show the film. The film would be kind of wrapped almost like a sewing machine around these kind of gears, and you'd crank it and it would move it up and down. So that's how that worked. The mutoscope, you may remember if you watched my Louis Le Prince video, was invented by William Dixon, who had developed the kinetoscope for Thomas Edison, before being fired by Edison for working with competitors on the mutoscope. The reason for the misconception about what a Nickelodeon was is due most likely to a song written in 1949, a few decades later, by Stephen Weiss and Bernie Baum, called Music, 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 Put Another Nickel In, featuring the lyric, Put Another Nickel in the Nickelodeon, which there referred to a sort of jukebox or a player piano or a pianola. You know, the pianos that have the things, the music, and it plays itself. You all know what I'm talking about. I'm kind of... everything so far. I mean, I've known bits and pieces of cinema history and I've always been interested in it. I am amazed so far at just how much was catalyzed by something scandalous or had something scandalous involved, or, I mean, just sketchy as all get out. The White Rats, we had the Nickelodeon. Who knows how much longer it would have taken if the theater managers would treat the vaudeville acts and performers with any kind of respect and not gouge them to where they couldn't make any money bringing in the crowds and bringing in the money for the theater. If there was any sort of decent contracts or anything there, then this super racist group called the White Rats wouldn't have organized a strike, which then led to the Nickelodeons. It's like, why? Who knows how much longer it would have taken for theaters to really take off, for film to take off, because a lot of people, it was sort of looked down upon at first. It was like, ooh, films, they're so... Like how people are sometimes still and were very snobbish about live acts, but even vaudeville was not considered necessarily legitimate theater. So you had like, it went from legitimate theater like Shakespeare to the vaudeville acts, which are these little singing and dancing troupes, to film. That's, you know, you're just kind of boop, boop, boop going down the line of respectability. So films were not real, they were a thing, and people indulged themselves with films. But who knows how or when it would have taken off the way that it did, or if it would have, if someone would have thought to create a theater dedicated solely to film, if there hadn't been the necessity of it with the vaudeville performers striking. It's just, I don't know. It's just funny how history works, isn't it? And I will leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Catch a movie you enjoy, and yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye.